And it's welcome back to 2025's first Deep Analysis podcast. We love ugly data. So that means it's series 3, episode 1. I didn't have to write down the episode number this time. It was an easy one to remember. I'm here. Of course, I'm here because I'm always here. And with me is Alan. Hi, Alan.
Hey there.
So if you're joining us for the first time in 2025, then welcome. Thank you. I'm not always this enthusiastic. I must have quite a lot of caffeine in me at the moment. Part of the format of the podcast today, and always, in fact, is to tell you the format of the podcast. So here's the format of the podcast. The format is 3 topics, 30 minutes, roughly about 10 minutes a topic, about something that we've written about recently, heard about recently, or we discussed it in our group chat recently, and all the other ways in which we get sort of collect trending information together, and we try and package this for you. Anything that we talk about on here, whether it's got links or other documents, we try and add to the show notes. I'll try to remember to remind myself to do that during it as well. But let's try and get into it with our first topic of the year, which is AI Agent Explainer. We trailed this a little bit last year. I was writing this at the end of the year. We published our first chunky report of the year, Alan. So, which is called, it's very much, it might be a UK reference, a Ron Seal title. Ron Seal is a kind of paint and varnish thing, and their strapline does exactly what it says on the tin. That's like their historic strapline. So for this is AI agents, what they are, how they work, where organizations might best use them. I think that's a reasonable summation of what we got here, Alan, right?
It is, and it's an important one. I mean, commercially for us, it's probably not in that sense, but for the world at large, it's very important because everybody's talking about agents, and to be blunt, and this is not to be patronizing or condescending, almost nobody knows what they're talking about, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, certainly there are people in R&D at Salesforce and Microsoft and Oracle, whatever, they do know what they're talking about. But when it comes to deploying it's, and we'll probably touch on this later, but there's just so much hype and noise that, you know, something like this document is needed that breaks it down and actually explains, this is what we're talking about. And you can get this for free. That's why I was joking that it's maybe not commercially.
Well, I just put up on screen. You said commercially it might not be huge.
No, but we could have put this behind a firewall, and we didn't. Right? We want people to download this and make use of it and start conversations within their organizations. And those organizations might be technology vendors, they might be investors, but I would hope a lot of enterprises get this so that at least they have more of a level playing field when people are coming in to try and sell them stuff, right? So they actually have some idea what they're dealing with here, because it's complicated topic.
Well, it is indeed. And just for those people who are listening rather than viewing, I've got a screenshot of the front page of the report. Text is all a bit blurry. Don't try and read it. If you want to read it, you can download it, and you can download it for free. There is a form on the screen that you can see. We'll put also the links here, or you just go to deepanalysis.net, find us there. You can give us your first name and last name and company name and country and email. So the minimum standard, notice no phone number. We won't even try that because no one's going to pick up the phone anyway. You can download it. It's 15 pages, around 6,000 words. So it's a couple of lunch hours or one chunky commute to read. And rather than try and get through the whole report today, what I thought we would do is pick up kind of what's the high level thing, because I think one of the reasons we sat down and thought we would write this last year was that, a bit like we did with AI assistants the year before, last year, lots of people beginning to be asked the question by their execs, by their board, by their investors, what's our agent story? What are we doing with agents, right? And the answer was that most people, well, I don't really know how they're going to be impactful to us. But they couldn't really say that because everybody needs to think that they know what they're talking about. So the idea, this is a primer for you to answer that question. So when somebody says to you, if someone important says to you, somebody above your pay grade says to you, hey, what's our story around agents? What's our agent strategy here? You've got a bunch of not just pithy one-liners, although there should be some pithy one-liners in there, but you've got an idea about how to represent what it does and what it doesn't do in terms of adding organizational value to where you work, which I think is kind of like the point of all this. I mean, benchmarking models is all very exciting, but it's very much an inside baseball. It's a very non-UK reference for you.
Yeah,
kind of thing, and it's not really relevant to how is it helping our organization perform? So we focus very much on that. How is it helping your organization do things you couldn't do before?
Yeah, and we've run 3 big surveys this past year, right? And they're consistent. People want to do something. They're excited about the potential, but they don't know how to. I mean, that's clear, absolutely clear.
Yeah. I think one thing I would say, if you're going to make a word very important to your report, if anybody who's thinking about doing this, and I pick a particular word that's very important here, make sure it's a word you can say. Because having written the report, I then found that the word specificity is actually very hard for me to say, to the point where I've actually got it written down phonetically, both in my notepad with my notes for this, because some prep, and also on my whiteboard in case I can't see my notes because I'm as blind as a bat. So specificity is really, really important. And why is specificity really important? Well, one, I've learned to say it. I'm going to keep saying it now because I've learned to say it. But also, it's the thing that separates where we were 2 years ago when people started to play with LMMs and where we are now in terms of how this applies to your organization. So let me explain that. For people who are watching this, they can see a diagram on the right-hand side of the screen, which kind of shows an upward trending graph with LMMs at the bottom as being non-specific and agents with LMMs and RAG at the top being highly specific, to say as you go through the LMM and then RAG and then agent kind of maturity, what you are doing is adding a specificity to the response you're expecting to get from the black box technology of which agents is loosely describing here, right? So what are agents bringing to your organization? It's allowing you to do things which are much more specific to your organization, and specifically here, I'm dangerous of overusing that word now, to the tasks and processes which define the way in which your organizations work. Now, if we think a little bit about LMMs, where LMMs started to get used, and this is very much an assistant stuff, was they were very much there to help you with tasks. They were like your little task monkey. Hey, can you do this little thing? Can you abbreviate this? Can you summarize that? Can you assemble these little bits of information? They were very much task focused. And as those tasks required to be more specific to the organization, we added RAG, which basically allowed us to give access to a pre-approved chunk of documents. So it was more specific, but it was still a huge chunk of documents. So it allowed you to do some things which are more organizationally relevant, but still you are generally task leaning and not enormously specific. What agents are designed to do is to move from tasks really into full processes or even sets of processes, which they're able to manage to a degree of autonomy or semi-autonomy on the basis that they can assemble sets of tasks into plans, if you like. And they have reasoning engines allow you to do that. Getting a little bit more into the depths of the report. So if you're looking for what's an agent do, it allows me to operate processes, whereas previously we've only really looked at tasks and individual tasks. Does that make sense, Alan?
It does, and with all of that, I mean, it's all real. I think that we have to point that out, right?
Yeah.
Of hype cycles. Sometimes, I mean, in my career, I've come across lots of companies who told me they can do X and they can't do anything of the sort, right? This is real technology. I mean, the technology does work, but the more specific you want to be, I mean, this is a lot of work. This is a lot of work. So I think the only thing is to say here is that, like a lot of hype cycles before it, the technology is actually pretty good. The work involved for your organization to get them to do what you want them to do is not insignificant. Right?
And it very much depends on where your starting point is. And I think this is where we go through. So to get more specific, you have to get more complex. What's the complexity? Well, the complexity, as I said, is binding what an agent can do, what it can plan for, what it can execute to the parts of your organization which already have automation in place. Now, this is a critical thing that gets missed a lot of the time, is that you're not able to operate within the largely heterogeneous business application environment, so basically all the stuff you have. The agent has to be able to be hooking into existing workflows, existing business processes, compliance, and blah, 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 all of that stuff that we know exists. So one, you have to have that straight, but two, you also have to have the hooks and handles and the triggers in place to enable the agent to operate safely and within the boundaries you wish it to.
Yeah, the only thing I'd pick up there is all the things we know exist, all the things we know should exist.
Oh, of course, yes.
Yes, and that is the reality. I mean, Mark Benioff was bad-mouthing Microsoft just the other day, saying,
"Well, it's good. It's good. It's a hobby for him. It's pretty much a hobby.
It's a hobby for him." And I think your phrase was, "People in glass houses should be careful," right? And you're 100% right. However, he does make a very good point, and we know this, and we've known this for literally since something like SharePoint came out, right?
Yeah.
It's capable of, it's being designed to be compliant and have tight permissions and be secure. Are people using it like that? No, a lot of the times it's a dumping ground. And these are the kind of things, just the practical hurdles you're going to hit is that, we need, we've got this process. Do we? Or is 3/4 of that process in Debbie's head? And
Well,
just updating the system at the end of the day.
What? You want to hold that thought because we're going to come back to that specifically on Microsoft in the next segment. So park that thought about what's in Debbie's head. We'll come back to that. Something I just want to add in there. I specifically didn't in this report get into the whole deterministic versus probabilistic outcomes, right? And one of the reasons why I did wanted to do that is 99.9% of the actions that happen inside an organization are deterministic, right? We know the inputs and we know this is the range of outputs. So when we get into this battle, some people are having about, we should only really put agents to work towards probabilistic things. Great. Well, there's nothing for them to do then. Most organizations aren't necessarily, most of the time, want to be betting outcomes on probability rather than what they know will work. And of course, we've got that range of existing business applications. So, workflows, RPAs, blah, 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 which are there to handle those more simple deterministic tasks where we know what the inputs and the outputs are most of the time. So I think what we've done is they basically open the can and let some of the worms out here. It's not the biggest report in the world. Don't worry, it's not particularly arduous to read it. However, the idea is it's supposed to provide you with some of the grist that you're going to need, some of the cud you're going to need to chew. Or these aren't great marketing lines. I'm sorry for that. But basically, to give you the kind of information you're going to need to have on your first whiteboard before you start to then apply what's our organizational context onto these to understand it. So we're not pretending to give you all the answers, because right now there aren't a lot of answers to give. Well, there are a lot of understanding what are the right questions to be posing and the right investigations to be seeking within inside your organization. Is that fair, Alan? Is that a reasonable sell? Or am I underselling it again?
No, that's exactly right. And I think, just to caveat there, anybody who tells you they've figured all of this out, the line, this is early days. We're all trying to figure it out.
No, you're absolutely right. So let's move on to something else. Now, the last two podcasts of last year, for those who are along regularly, was our November one when we did our awards, and then in December we did our predictions. So we haven't done any kind of news, no, we're not really a news thing, but sometimes things happen. We want to discuss it. This happened in December. I think actually it was after the last podcast, but this is the first opportunity to talk about it, which is we're biz app people, and we've always been biz app people. Are biz apps just a load of CRUD? So let's put that into some context. So in December, Satya Nadella was on the BG2 podcast, which is Bill Gurley and Brad Gerstner's podcast. Give you an idea. I think I looked on YouTube, 250,000 people had sat through this 2 hours. So they're a significantly larger audience than ours. And come closer to the monitor. We're a select bunch here. But we don't want to get into that whole 1.5 hours. But there's something specifically that Satya Nadella said, which I think is kind of interesting, and I thought it would be worth pulling out. So what he said, and we'll paraphrase this for a time, is that right now he said there are essentially business applications are essentially CRUD databases with a bunch of business logic. So what's a CRUD database? Well, CRUD is actually a term I thought had kind of gone away in the 1990s, but that create, update, delete, create. Was it create, update? What's the R stand for again?
Read, update. Delete.
Read, update. That's it. It's so long ago I've forgotten what it was. So basically, an application is basically a database that allows you to do creation and updates and deletions with a bunch of business logic associated to it. And in the world of agents, well, look, that business logic is all going to go to the agents. So what you're left with is a bunch of databases, and the agents themselves Well, they're just going to be multi-repository CRUD, right? So now this was highlighted in some of the reportage around it, and I'll link to some of it again in the show notes, as I said. As Satya Nadella said, one, SaaS is over. Applications are dead. Agents are going to replace all applications. And as you said about in the previous segment about all the business logic of the organization being in Debbie's head, but it's all going to move from Debbie's head to the agent's head. So I had some thoughts about that, which I've written down to try and keep them relatively tight. And I'll come back to you in a second, Alan, just to, your thoughts on it. But my kind of first one was that you're on a 90-minute podcast. You don't have to be so reductive about applications. Sure, if you want to describe business applications as a database with business logic, I mean, you're right. In the same way that golf is a very simple game, which you hit a ball with a stick into a hole. However, trying to play golf, much in the same way as trying to build or operate a bit of that business application, is significantly more difficult, more involved, and has a significantly larger industry around it. So if you take that reductive approach, sure, you can break everything down to its bare minimums. And I don't think when we're talking about something which you, and I think the best in Microsoft, believe agency is so important and transformative, that actually being reductive about business applications actually doesn't make that sound like it's a terribly exciting thing, right? It's kind of a bit of a dumb thing to say. Alan, I'll let you just jump in there while I just.
A couple of things there. So we have Geoffrey Moore came up with this term, or these terms, systems of transaction, or systems of engagement, systems of record, right? Yeah. And then you could throw into that mix systems of transaction, right? Whatever. Anyway, the point is business applications, be they from SAP, Oracle, Microsoft, Salesforce, whatever. You know, the theory was, and that's why they cost so much money, was that they sort of did the work, right? Mm. And there's a truth to that. But what we also know is over the years, they're actually doing less and less and less of the work because they didn't do it very well. And so workarounds came in. And so you actually do have a lot of systems where, or business applications, or biz apps, as we like to call them, that are actually just systems of record, right? Work gets done and then the system gets updated. And so he's got a point. However, this goes back to the agent thing. If you basically have an extremely expensive system of record, you have no idea of how and what went on for that record to be created, right? I mean, you know the logic. We bought something, we paid for something, it was delivered. But all of the intricacies of day-to-day activities are not there.
Well, and to go back to a point I made at the beginning where I made up a statistic, and I'm going to repeat the made up statistic now. And if you want to challenge me on it, not you, Alan, but anybody listening to, feel free, because I'm telling you it's made up. 99.9% of business logic is deterministic inside an organization, right? So you're taking something which might be considered to be expensive at one point, these business applications, and you're saying, hey, we're going to take the vast majority of these transactions, which are deterministic, and we're going to move them and process them in a more expensive place, which isn't really that suitable for deterministic stuff, because as we said, its skill really is in figuring things out and probabilistic. That's a dumb way of moving your workloads around, and I would just expect a little bit more clever logic from the people who were fundamentally important in bringing business applications to us.
Well, that's where I was going with that. I mean, it's that, you know, we've been doing this a long time now, right? And going back to our own research, right? Again, this is consistent. It's consistent across all of the surveys we've done, right? People are fed up with their business applications, their legacy business apps, right? So it's a little bit rich when the people who built them, sold them, made billions out of them are saying, yeah, they don't really work, do they?
No.
There's a bit of irony in that.
And yet that's never challenged. And that's never challenged for all sorts of reasons. Partly because if you look at the people who were interviewing on this case, they're both investors. They're both long-term serial investors and have been investing all these things along the way. The idea is that anything new replaces everything that came before, And if you ask about this stuff before, you didn't see it, it never existed, and it's been buried in a field somewhere. That's kind of the attitude we have towards
makes me think when people come out with things like this, it's like, well, do you owe some of your customers a refund then?
Yeah, yeah. So in this case, what we're talking about is, why don't you move it to something that you know you're skilled at, you're reliable about it, and has a cost, and move it to somewhere where you don't know how it works, you haven't got the skills, and it costs 3 times as much. I find that's a difficult sell. And someone who worked on the commercial side of software for a long time, that will be difficult to take to customers. But of course, there's the other thing here, which is, you know, we're talking about known quantities, and we're talking about processes that we have designed manually and have good. You could talk about organizational knowledge, you could talk about organizational scar tissue, but that's all the stuff that's in Debbie's brain that we talked about earlier on. Is how to operate that in the real world, where the human operators fill in the spaces. They're kind of almost the exception processors in the way that these things work, and that's, you know, they produce the elasticity that you need to operate these things.
And then that's where we're going to have big problems in the next few years, because to be blunt about it, that's not the business model these technology vendors are looking for, right? They want to own the process from beginning to end and charge you a fortune for it. And it's not going to work. That doesn't mean agentic AI doesn't work, but I do think that the scale of the ambition is totally out of whack with the reality of the modern workplace or the modern enterprise and where they're at.
Yeah, and I think something that's worth mentioning, I just got up on screen just a quote, and I'll put the reference to the quote in the article in the show notes, so you can find the reference of it with a little bit. It's just expanding on those Nadella quotes. But the idea here that SaaS is synonymous with business applications, of course, is dangerous and wrong. Business applications were around before SaaS. A big chunk of applications, possibly the majority, might be a bit.
I would say certainly at the high end, the majority is.
Well, there you go. So the majority of business applications are not running in SaaS now, and the part of one of the reasons why agents are important right now is actually much more about the economics of how SaaS operates. So we haven't got time to get into that today. But the important thing for you to remember is that if you're a buyer of software, is the majority of the profits from software in SaaS is in the second half of contracts, right? Because all of the cost of sale, all of the discounts, they're all applied right at the beginning. Right, that was different with perpetual software, where everybody's payday was on day one when you paid the $1 million. Now you're paying the $1 million over 10 years. All the profitable years are in the second half, right? So the idea is to make sure that you're staying in for the latter years of that contract, because that's where all the money is made. That's worth bearing in mind when you're thinking about how does the economics of this work when we're talking about early discounting and that kind of thing. It's because the long tail is where the money is made by software companies. Their margin is much more healthy towards the end of those contracts.
Yeah, I mean, this is a topic for another podcast, but just picking up on one point, instead of paying $1 million up front, you pay $1 million over 10 years. No. In the old world, you paid $1 million up front, and you actually ended up paying $2.5 million over 10 years.
Well, you paid $1 million up front, and then paid $200,000 a year in support and maintenance.
Yeah, and you can never get off it with SaaS. Yeah.
No, I mean, you think a difference between perpetual, and there are lots of organizations, probably in some quite scary situations, who are running applications out of support, which are poor, but you could say, you know what, we're not paying support and maintenance anymore, we're going to risk it, right? And I've been in organizations with very critical stuff that's on the risk it, but you could. With SaaS, you can't. You turn it off and it's gone.
Okay, you miss a payment, you've lost it.
Yeah. You know, they literally kind of come to your house and they go to tow it away.
Yeah, I mean, you're renting, you're not buying. Yeah.
So let's get into the last topic. And last year we did a little bit of things to avoid at conferences, things to avoid in vendor pitches, things to do in vendor pitches, things to do at conferences. And we were talking last year about this, and we felt it was very. We're going to try and blame blame everybody else for what's wrong in the world rather than us. So we thought we would do this one a little bit about analysts, and this includes ourselves. This is not an attempt to throw stones at our competition. If we do that, maybe we do that. But this is really thinking about analyst value. So the point of thinking about this was, what are the parts of what an analyst does that aren't necessarily really abundantly apparent, that we think that they add value, and also what are the things that analysts do that actually decrease value from client organizations. Next time Dan's on, and I'm hoping to get Dan on in March, I think. If you've missed Dan today, I'm sorry. Yet you had 2 Dan episodes in a row. You have to wait for Dan for March for the next one of those. We'll ask Dan next time he's on, and he'll contribute, and we'll get the full set again. So Alan, increasing value. I've got for my first one here, and I apologize because I took it before you did. One thing I don't think that people realize analysts do is we spend a lot of time listening to end users.
Yep.
We spend a lot of time listening to not just how they buy and how they implement, just thinking completely away from technology, what's happening in their industry, what's happening in the way in which they're hiring people, what's happening in the way they're firing people, what's happening in how they're skilling people, how they're rewarding people, and of course, all of the things around technology. And that enormously informs not just what we do as deep analysis, but that should inform every analyst that you listen to, certainly those that you pay for, because why we're able to do that, we've got the time to do that, and we've often got the access to do that in the way that other people have. It's not a special skill. We're not, it's not some sort of superhero thing. Well, I was thinking maybe it is a superhero thing, but it allows us to have this stuff, to write these notes, to listen to different people in different places and different industries globally, and compare those. And those really do help us synthesize what we think of our view of the world as we move forward. And I know, having stolen that one out of your mouth, you've got a kind of similar one about the places we go and the people we speak to as how we increase value.
Yeah, I mean, it's a variety of experiences, and it ties in. I mean, a good analyst. I mean, I've been an analyst a long time, and I've managed lots of analysts and trained lots of analysts, I suppose. One of the things I've always said to everybody, and I've pushed it at times, is that we're going to hear the brightest. We're very privileged. We hear stuff before anybody else, right? It's amazing, and that is a privilege, and it's cool. You have to balance that with talking to credit unions and pharmaceutical and whoever, and systems integrators, and sometimes investors. You've got to balance that, because there isn't one story. There's multiple stories, and it's our job to try and make sense of that. So, for example, this is a silly example really, but if we take the world of where ECM is going, right, enterprise content management. So I just give you 2 examples. I was at the Highland Community Life Conference in DC last year, and I met with the Highland executives and the CEO, but I also talked with lots of their customers. And I did exactly the same thing in Vegas with OpenText at their annual conference. And what I get, how many other people went to both of those conferences?
Only analysts.
Only analysts, right? And I'm actually thinking, there was only about 2 or 3 of us who actually went to both of them. And the reality is, you get a sense of where things are at, where they're thinking, where their customers are at, where the challenges are, because you're contracting 2 companies who are in direct competition with one another, right? So going back in the day, I would go to Documentum and FileNet, right? Apparently these 2 were direct competitors. You couldn't get 2 companies more different.
Yep.
So again, when we synthesize that down into our advisory services, into advisory calls, into briefings, into our reports, you're getting pretty much a unique perspective, right? And as you said, it's not a superpower, but it is very unusual. And I guess we're going towards the what isn't value, but not all analysts do that. I'm not going to name that. I would love to, but for legal reasons, I won't. I've been to major conferences. I've seen analysts I've known for years. They never leave the analyst room.
Yep.
They'll go to a briefing with exec. They will not mix with the great unwashed, as they seem to think that, the customer.
I was once at a conference, and one name analyst, who at that point was independent, set themselves up in their own conference room.
Yeah.
In the conference, not their room, but they kind of booked out a conference room and expected people to be brought to them.
It's just unbelievable.
Like, well, that's a bold move. In a place where there are thousands of people you could talk to, you're only going to have a grant an audience to those people who talk to you.
I mean, as pandered analysts, we're often, given breakfast and lunch and whatever, right?
Yep.
My breakfast, unless I don't know if I'm in a really bad mood, I always go down and have breakfast with the attendees, and I'll just sit at one of the tables. Sometimes, honestly, it's a really awkward breakfast and everybody's just trying to avoid eye contact. Mm-hmm. And other times, great conversations break out. By the way, I'm always transparent when they ask me. I actually say, I'm an analyst. I'm here to find out. I'm here to learn. And they will tell you all sorts of stuff, right?
So let's move on to reducing value, Alan. Let's talk about reducing value. Tell me about hype.
Hype and overhype, the term you hate.
Oh.
I think when analysts are hyping something, that is a bad thing, right? Analysts should be, wherever possible. It's impossible to be completely neutral, right? You're always going to have your opinions. You're always going to lean. You're always going to have your favorites. That's life. We're human beings, but you should strive to be neutral. When you're hyping something, particularly something that's new, how do you know this is going to be a success, right? How do you know that? And there are analyst firms out there, again, wish I could name and shame them, but there are analyst companies out there that basically make their living by solely hyping whatever the vendor asks them to hype. That's not analysis, that's PR. And I actually take offense at it. I'm serious. I literally.
Yeah, absolutely. And we were talking last week about. We talked earlier on about how software companies are like, hey, all that stuff we did before, it's rubbish. Don't ignore we ever said that. Well, you could say the same about analysts, right? In the sense that there are well-known by the year X, Y will definitely have happened statements that have moved markets, that have moved investments. They were invented and then they were discarded, right? And people's livelihoods have been made and lost on the back of those. And it's irresponsible to do that. And vendors analyst firms should not do it. However, what they have proven is it's a successful sales tactic, so they'll continue.
Well, it is, and I was talking with I mentioned this in something I wrote actually, but it really just struck me when he said it. I was chatting with the CEO of a fairly large software company, and he just said, analysts really should be responsible what they say because it can cause great damage, and I 100% agree with him, right? I mean, you've probably written things that I've said, I don't know, we should say that, Matt. And Dan's done it, and I've done it, right? People have said so you don't want to be so careful that you're just bland and you don't have any thoughts and don't have any opinions, right? But the truth is, I really upsets me when I see people hyping stuff and they've got it straight from the vendor. Yeah. And it's deliberate.
Yeah, absolutely. So
model, and people are believing it, and they're spending a lot of money.
Yep. They're mortgaging their careers and their livelihoods to it, and they're doing that sometimes on a false premise. My one's a little bit simpler. I hate when I see in an analysis over a market or a trend, how's this going to turn out? Only time will tell. Only time will tell. Only time will tell. It's not analysis. What that means is I haven't got a clue. If you haven't got a clue, say you've not got a clue. And then you shouldn't publish it, because as analysts, we're supposed to be able to tell you what we think will happen. Now, sometimes we're wrong, and when you're wrong, it's important to say you're wrong, not bury it in the garden. But you can't just get out and say, well, here's a bunch of stuff, and my analysis is, meh.
Yeah, I mean, so we talked about it. I'm guilty of it, and it's funny. I mean, I've told this story so many times, but it was scarred into me. Was literally the very first thing I ever wrote as an analyst. I printed it out, left it on my boss's desk, went to lunch, came back. I came back from lunch, and there it is back on my desk, covered in red marker pen, crossing out, will it, won't it, can it, can't, be clear. That's what they're paying you for, your opinion. So I agree with you. When I use it, and I'm going to stop, and if anybody wants to use ChatGPT and go through my past work, you'll find I have used it quite a bit. I use it in a very English way. When I say only time will tell, it sort of means I don't think this has a hope in hell.
Right. Okay.
But I'm going to stop that. I'm going to be clearer now.
So so it's basically mealy mouth, but with an underlying subtext if you choose to seek it.
Yeah, it's a bit passive aggressive, isn't it? Yeah. So
we will come back to because we've completely run out of time. We'll come back to the analyst values thing when Dan's on next. So yeah, what? Maybe we'll do it again. Maybe we'll do another round as well, and we'll do a report on that. But that's it for this time. Thank you for joining us for the first podcast of 2025. We always really appreciate your custom and listening or watching this. Next time there'll be 3 more topics, 30 minutes to discuss them in. Show notes out imminently, if not already, and we'll see you next month. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye.